Check Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw from Check News. Thank you for joining us on television or on podcast, wherever you get your podcast feeds. There's a lot going on in BC politics this week, and we're going to bring in the Pod Squad to talk a bit about it. But obviously, first, the death of Queen Elizabeth II has led to worldwide ramifications and a pause for the BC government, a media blackout, a public communications blackout, and a cancellation of all of government's events in the middle of Premier John Horgan rolling out a new affordability package to combat cost of living and inflation, which is where we are going to start and bring in the Pod Squad. We have Jillian Oliver, BC Green strategist extraordinaire. Jillian, thank you for being here this week.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
And we have Jeff Ferrier, Senior Vice President at Hill & Knowlton and a former Senior Communications Strategist in the BC NDP government. Jeff, thanks for being here.
Howdy, season premiere, exciting.
Season premiere, that's right. A new look, but the same great content that we're going to bring you and the same great insight. Katie Merrifield will be joining us again. She's just away working on the Pierre Poilievre campaign, which is a totally separate topic we're not going to get to this week, but nonetheless, she will be back for sure. We want to start with the affordability package. It was billed as $1,500 of relief. It's not actually $1,500 in cash. There's a kind of rent component to that as well, but it is income tested. Based on the size of your family and based on your income, you will get a certain amount of financial aid from the government, up to $760 in cash over 6 months. Jillian, what do you think? Good program, bad program, missed the mark? What government should have been doing?
I think, there's obviously been pressure building to deliver on this. We've seen other provinces move forward with giving people money, and in the wake of the announcement of the surplus, I think that pressure increased even more. I think that as far as, just giving people money, this is the best way that you can do it. It's targeted, like you said, to people below a certain income level, targeted to family size. And it's also being done through existing programs so that the government doesn't have to create more, bureaucracy around it, and which could lead to, more cost for administering the grants, as well as just make it take longer. So I do think, there's been some fair criticism that the government has been overselling the dollar figure. I don't know why they are doing that. I think that it's not effective because it kind of just sets people's expectations high, and then they feel underwhelmed. So I'm not sure why they did that, or are continuing to do that. But other than that, I think that this was needed, necessary, and that it's being rolled out in a fairly thoughtful way.
Yeah, I agree with you there that I do not understand why the government billed this as a $1,500 figure when some people online are saying, great, when do I get my $1,500 check? There is no $1,500 check. Maybe you get $760 spread over 6 months, Jeff. That compares to some other provinces like Saskatchewan with a $500 check. In BC, these aid programs will come through two different existing streams. You may not even notice the top-ups, or maybe you will over the next few months. Is that a harder sell for government politically, or where do you think they landed here?
I think it's really good policy. I think it's really meaningful help for people who need it the most. I like that they're using the existing programs, and it's climate action tax credit. I think it's like $164 more per adult and $41 per child, again based on income. Existing program, so they know the incomes and they can target for the people who need the help the most. Same with the BC Family Benefit. I think it was the BC Child Opportunities Fund before, January, February, March. You'll notice $58 more per child for people who qualify. They'll notice that. And I know that there's been some falderall, harsh word, falderall around the rent increases. And capped at 2% and question of, is that really a benefit? Because, rents will still go up a couple percent. But, for folks, there's 600,000 households who are renters across BC. And rent is the biggest single expense that they have in their lives. I know in this household, we were worried about what does 5.5% mean for us if they stick with inflation. And so that's meaningful help. And it may not be a great big check like they're doing in Saskatchewan, but it's help for people, and it's going to be real, and it's going to be make a difference for people who are struggling to get by.
Sure. And I agree with you. I think the rent control, for lack of a better word, the cap is definitely needed. Allowing rents to raise at the rate of inflation of 5 to 6% this year would have been, in the words of the Attorney General, former Attorney General David Eby, 3 months ago, would have been a shock. But the government signaled it was going to do this, and then it said it was going to do it, and then it did it, and then extrapolated a hypothetical savings of $800 for an average family and threw it onto the total like you were going to get it. And I don't understand. It just felt to me like they missed a bit of the mark on that one. But I want to throw open to both of you a different question here, and we touched on the income testing part of this. So to get the maximum amount, $760, you need to be in a family of 4 with a household income of under $117,000, which is kind of the lowest cutoff in one of the benefit funds. That helps the people who need it the most, as the Premier mentioned, Jeff, and as you said as well. But there are people who make more than that who are looking at this wondering, why does the government think I'm too wealthy for help or too well off for help when I have, a household income of just slightly above that? How does that cut, Jillian, in terms of who the NDP is speaking to and what kind of voter they're reaching there with an income threshold that looks like that?
I think that they have their mind on the budget. The cost for this package, I think it's at about $600 million, which is quite a bit for a whole bunch of new stuff being announced while they're going into budget prep. We talked about this last week, where we're kind of in an interesting situation where we had a huge economic boom last year with the surplus, with stronger than expected COVID recovery, but now things are changing. We're seeing lots of reports about home sales falling, lots of predictions about home prices falling a lot. So I think the government is wanting to be responsive to the people that really are struggling the most to make ends meet. While still kind of, not coming out with a program that's going to cost, upwards of $1 billion, while they're still sort of figuring out what kind of budget they're going to be dealing with going into the beginning of next year. So I think they're sort of trying to walk that line that we talked about last week between, delivering on affordability, delivering on their promise to be working for people, like they always say, while also, being seen as responsible fiscal managers. We talked a lot about, do people still care about deficits? I'm of the view that I don't think that it's as top of mind as the cost of living is. So I think it'll be really interesting to see if there is that kind of blowback that you're talking about for people making above the income threshold. But I think we'll also have to see, if the government is going to be looking at bigger programs, maybe more longer systemic things that they can do to help more folks with affordability in the long run in next year's budget.
I just wondered, Jeff, I agree with Jillian that budgetary pressures, obviously this is an expensive program the way it's designed right now, but I just wondered, the NDP made such inroads in the last 2 elections with middle income, middle class, urban voters in Metro Vancouver who probably have a household income of more than $117,000 to live in Metro Vancouver, who are hoping the NDP would get them. It's not like if you make more than that, you're not squeezed by inflation on household goods on one side and interest rates on your debt and your credit card and your mortgage on the other. So is the NDP missing a pot of voters that it brought in the last couple of elections by targeting this? And you'd also mentioned online an interesting point about not wanting too much of this money to increase inflation as well with spending if you spread it out too far. But what do you make of all that?
Lots of good points and good questions. I suppose the rote woke answer is that you want the money going to folks who take the bus to work and not people who race their supercars on city streets. But I think you're right that it misses those communities in Surrey and Burnaby and the Tri-Cities and the North Shore and everywhere in BC, where everyone is feeling the pinch, working families, working people. I think the ICBC rebate that came out earlier this year gets those folks. I think that the rent cap will help many of these folks. Some of them are homeowners. Many of them are renters, though. I think the provincial savings was estimated at a rent of $2,000 a month. I don't know too many people who pay that for rent. If they've got a family, they pay a lot more. So there'll be even more savings. And BC Hydro is working on something as well. But it is a fine line. There is a risk in targeting that you create ill feelings in that group. But you also have to keep your eye on the economics of this whole situation. $600 million into the economy at a time when inflation pressures are super high. I think that's manageable. You start sending checks to everyone in British Columbia and double, triple that amount. You increase the inflationary pressures. You create the situation where cost of living goes up even more, and you defeat what you're trying to achieve, which is helping people with cost of living. So it's good points. It's complex. Fine, tricky line. I think the government's hit it, but as with everything, there are consequences.
Yeah, I think if the government had taken the same pot of money and sent out checks to everyone, regardless of income, you would have ended up in a situation like the ICBC checks from earlier this year, where everyone got $115 and they went, that's it? That's all I get? And also people who had electric cars got it, and there was a kind of sense of, that's better than nothing, but it's almost basically nothing. And government chose to target it instead of spreading it out. And so some people aren't going to get anything here. 23% of families, about 123,000 families, will get the maximum amount in BC, and everyone else will get a sliding scale down from there. So government's kind of stuck in a position of spreading out this money to a lot of people and getting that blowback of that's not very great, or targeting it to people and some voters getting nothing at all, Jeff. And I think you hit on the sort of economics of that well. Anyone else want to jump in before we switch topics here? The other part of this, I guess, was it took 5 months to deliver this aid between when the Premier promised, and he used a mechanism that the BC Liberals had been calling on since the start of the year, the Climate Action Tax Fund, which are checks that go out. Does raise the question why the NDP just didn't listen to that months ago and how this took so long. But does anyone want to jump in on the timing, either of you?
I'm happy to very briefly say that you have to be careful when you spend this amount of money. There were questions about the fiscal situation of the government, whether, the forecast of a great big deficit for this year. I think the government was responsible to wait till they had clarity about, the $10 billion turnaround they had from what was forecast to what has turned out to be a $1.3 billion surplus for the last fiscal year. They're in a strong situation. Now they can be assured that they can roll this out, get this help out to people without potentially impacting investments in core public services like healthcare and education. If you spend money before you actually have it in the bank, there can be some unintended consequences. So I think that's why they waited. And I think it was responsible.
Sure. Jillian, 5 months, too long?
Yeah, I think politically, probably this would have had a greater impact had it come sooner, just because I think that people have been feeling a lot of acute financial pressure this year. The other thing that comes to mind, in addition to what Jeff raised, is the issue of the renters rebate. This has been something that the NDP have promised for 2 election cycles, and I think they're sort of starting to think that maybe it wasn't the smartest one from a policy front. But because of those repeated promises, there's that pressure. So I wonder if some of the delay was them trying to figure out, is there a way that we can, fine tune this policy to sort of make it make sense, so that we can still deliver on a specific promise. And I think maybe they kind of decided that they couldn't, and that's why we're getting this package instead. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that in the next before the next election.
Yeah, I totally agree. The renters rebate doesn't make a lot of sense, Jeff.
The Canucks will win the Stanley Cup before there's a renters rebate. That's my hot take.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, yeah. It isn't great policy to give people like $400 a year on their rent. It doesn't make a difference, like $30 a month or whatever it is. But anyways, that will be a political question for the NDP in the next election. And let's move on to the other issue this week, which was the tentative collective agreement, the tentative contract between the BC government and the BCGEU ending the strike by the BCGEU still needs to be ratified, but roughly this deal is between an 11 and a 13% wage increase over the next 3 years. The $2,500 bonus that was on the table is gone, rolled into the wages, and in return, both sides are compromising where the BCGEU did not get a direct link to maximum inflation. They got a link to inflation in the second and third years, but it's capped at an amount that may be lower than the actual inflation. So it depends. I think there's a lot of movement on both sides. The government had to put more money on the table to get this deal. Jeff, starting with you, good deal for taxpayers, good deal for the government, good deal for the union. What do you think?
Hey, labor peace in British Columbia potentially. I'm here for it. I think that when you have the province saying that it gave more than it wanted to give, and you have the union saying it got less than it wanted, it's a sign that negotiation worked, that things are reasonable, and so I think this is going to be good for British Columbia in terms of what it costs, but also in terms of the recognition of the important role workers played and continue to play in providing healthcare, education, and all sorts of public services. I think you look at the numbers, and it's 3.25% first year, up to 6.75% in the second year, 3% in the third year. Like, that's a good deal that the union has negotiated. There's I expect, as with all deals, there will be people who will say, well, that's not what we wanted. We wanted cost of living every year. So I expect there'll be a healthy debate in BCGEU, but I expect that it will get ratified, and the impact on broader negotiations. So with teachers and with, we've already seen it with health workers, with post-secondary education, is that this will set the framework for those deals. And BCGEU doesn't sign this deal unless it knows that the rest of what we call the House of Labor, the other unions, are generally okay, at least with the monetary issues, and that they would be okay with this being the framework for their deals. So I think it's good. I think we can afford it. We're in a strong fiscal position. It's going to preserve services and make it so that I don't have to buy Nanaimo bar whiskey anymore as the only thing that's at the liquor store. So
for
God
shame,
bless.
sir. For shame.
Good job, everyone.
Just use that as rubbing alcohol. Do not put it in your mouth. That's disgusting. But Jillian, does this take, as Jeff was mentioning, does it take some of the heat off of the NDP government on other future negotiations? It was facing a lot of pressure from its union allies and that were out on strike, essentially, the GEU. What does this do to that political temperature, do you think?
Yeah, I think because there's a lot more negotiations still to come. I think teachers and nurses, if I'm not mistaken. So I think I think it's great, and you could see that when the premier announced that he had reached a tentative deal, his sort of can't classic wearing his heart on his sleeve, he was excited and relieved. I think you could tell that they feel that the heat is off of them. I agree with what Jeff said. I think this is a middle ground. It's not I think if there's an issue, it's not exactly how it was sold to members, that it isn't a full cost of living allowance. It'll be interesting to see the ratification. I think it would obviously be imprudent of the union to agree if they didn't have a good sense of that already. But it'll be interesting to see, especially younger members, that sort of a thing, who might be feeling more pressure. But yeah, it's I think it's good that we're moving forward. We can't afford to lose more of these workers that are keeping services going, and hiring is really tough right now. So it's good for the province and good for the government to be able to move on to the next negotiations that it needs to tackle.
Mm-hmm. And I think the strike from the BCGEU certainly did produce movement from government. It sweetened the pot. It stayed within it. The finance minister says it stayed within its mandate. But Jeff, you mentioned whether taxpayers can afford this. We're going to pick that question up in the podcast version of the show. If you're watching us on Check, make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcast feeds. We have an extended discussion. We don't know how much this is going to cost And we don't have time on the TV show to get into that, but there is a question there that the finance minister has kind of walked around, because when you look at the deals, there are a lot of side agreement policy decisions the government has thrown in here, including things like rehiring private health workers into unions, changing classification grids, topping up other wages that add costs that won't be reflected necessarily in the agreement, but will be within government budgets, which is a discussion we will pick up on the podcast in a moment. Thank you so much for watching the show. Make sure that you subscribe to the podcast, but also you can check us out on Check Plus if you're looking for past episodes and more content. And we will have Katie Merrifield, who will be on the show next week as well. We're going to pick it up. It'll be a slightly different show. We're not sure how long this media blackout from the government in the wake of the Queen's death is going to last. The proclamation seems to be that the government can't do anything during that time. However, there is still the by-election in Surrey South that we're recording before that next week we'll break down and analyze as well. So, Jeff, Jillian, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. We'll be back next week with all the latest on political capital.